So you sit down to listen to your first opera, but instead of singing being the first thing you hear, there's this long musical introduction. Did I miss the memo? Isn't this an opera? Isn't it supposed to be singing? Why is there this long musical introduction? And where are the ideas for the operatic stories coming from anyway? In this video, I'm going to break down everything that you need to know about overtures and understanding what a libretto is. Hi, Cassandra here with Opera Appreciation for Black folks. On this channel, I work to make opera equitable by teaching you how to appreciate a little bit more opera in your daily life. An overture is a piece of music for the orchestra to play at the beginning of a ballet or an opera. Basically any long vocal work. Well, ballets aren't vocal, but you get what I'm saying. It's also a French word that means opening, and its actual purpose is to shut people up before the show actually begins. Remember back to the 15th and 16th century when Shakespeare was doing his thing, the way that people appreciated theater was a very different set of norms. Today, we appreciate our shows quietly and in silence out of respect for the actors or the musicians or whoever's on stage. But back when Mr. Shakespeare was writing, he was writing his shows because he knew he was competing for people's attention. Remember, theaters at that time were open theaters, they were outside, and they used natural light that people could see what was happening on stage. It wasn't like they had stage lights that they could turn on. So most theater goers were going to see shows literally in the middle of the afternoon because that's when the light was the best. The theater was also the place where people got to really gawk at the rich and the wealthy for the first time, because otherwise there was no other place for these two sections of social classes to interject except at the theater. It was also a place where there was a lot of entertainment happening because people weren't being entertained by their phones at this time. They were being entertained by watching bears fighting or people attacking each other or just having sex with one another. Like, a lot of things were simpler, but also way more violent and grotesque. And that translated into the theater scene as well. People didn't sit back and enjoy the theater like they do today. They were booing and were talking loudly and not paying attention to the show. Things were happening on stage. In fact, because there was no public bathrooms, people would actually get up on the sides of the Globe Theater and actually urinate or just defecate or whatever needed to happen, because this was a live action experience. And they spent more time either heckling the people on stage, booing them, cheering on the heroes, booing the villains, throwing food at them, getting pickpocket. Prostitutes would be in the mix, so I'm sure there was all kinds of interesting sexual things happening. It was just a melting pot of people, and social classes were coming together. The people that had money sat in the upper sections where they had their own box that they could lock, and they would usually have cushions to sit on, and you would pay a certain amount of money to have that privilege. But for the people that just wanted to see the show, you paid a penny and you walked in and you sat in the groundling section, or what we would now call the orchestra section, and you would pay the cheapest and you would get the closest experience, but that also meant that they were probably the rowdiest group in the bunch as well. So the introduction of the overture was a way to compete for people's attention and to let them know, despite all their ramble and talking and engagement with each other, it was a way to let people know, hey, the show's about to start, so even if you're gonna still be talking, but maybe bring it down just a little bit so that we can actually pay attention to the fact that the show's about to start. And so that kind of translated into the Italian mindset as well. But the Italians were the ones that birthed opera, and so they decided to go a little bit differently with it. It was still sort of an outdoor thing at the time before we started having closed theaters, but they were the ones that introduced the idea of an overture, of something that was to announce to people that things were about to start. The average overture lasts anywhere from 1 to 3 minutes, and not all operas have overtures, just so you know. So a lot of composers were not so quick to adopt the idea of an overture, but the people that did were popular composers like Mozart, Rossini, Puccini, and became into fashion that there would be some sort of music before the opera would officially begin to announce what was happening. Some composers got really smart and began to add in cool themes that would sort of tickle your ears to let you know that, hey, you're about to hear this theme happen within the context of the opera. Or there were other composers who could care less about what was happening in the context in the opera and just really needed to put the show together. So they were like, well, I'm just going to use this other piece of music that I already wrote and just tack it onto the beginning of this story or this opera so that it serves its true purpose, which is to announce to people that the show is about to start, to please quiet down, to please pay attention, because now we are in for a vocal story that is going to be sung to us. Composers that used music that had nothing to do in relationship with the actual opera were composers like Rossini. For example, The Barber of Seville has a completely separate overture from what the actual opera is about. He just merged two different pieces and decided to put them together. I don't know, to save time. Who knows how many operas he was writing? He might have been a really busy man. Puccini was another one, and Verdi too was another one that had a different idea about the overture. They just really wanted to jump into the opera. So the overture feels like a sort of a quick 1 minute, like do-do-do, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum, done, and then we're right into the show. Because there were composers that were beginning to pull in musical ideas that would be later featured within the context of the opera, because they were pulling those musical ideas and sort of sprinkling them into the overture to excite people's ears about what they were about to listen to, it meant that the composer needed to really be thinking about the libretto. And a libretto is literally the Italian word for little book. It's a diminutive for the Italian word libro, which means book, and libretto is a little book. And so libretto also translates to a librettist. So a librettist is a special person who writes the text of an opera or long vocal work, kind of like a playwright, who specializes in that wonderful intersection between text, music, and theater, as well as working with the composer to make sure that their musical ideas are highlighted. So a libretto is basically a story that's inspired from a book that is now translated by the librettist to be set to music and singing in such a way that still keeps with the storyline, but is usually sort of broken down in a way that can be easily digested for musical understanding and appreciation. Now, there are some famous librettists and composer combinations. One of the most famous is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Lorenzo Da Ponte. Lorenzo Da Ponte is actually a very interesting character, and I'll get more into him a little bit later. But first, they wrote 3 full operas together. They wrote Mozart's most popular operas, which was Le Nozze di Figaro, Così fan tutte, and Don Giovanni. Another famous combination of librettist and composer would be Terence Blanchard and Cassie Lemons, who did Fire Shut Up in My Bones. Remember, librettos are inspired by books, they're inspired by history, and they're inspired by wherever they can get stories from. Some famous ones are Le Nozze di Figaro, that was based on a series of books by Pierre Beaumarchais, the opera Falstaff, which was written by Verdi and was inspired by Shakespeare's Falstaff. Same story, just in opera form. Another example is by historical events. For example, Un ballo in maschera, written by Verdi. It is literally a story about a 1792 assassination of King Gustav III of Sweden, who was shot as a result of political conspiracy while attending a masked ball and only died 13 days later from his wounds. So Verdi took that very intense political moment and turned it into an opera. He said it was the most frustrating experience of his career because there were so many people that didn't want the truth to come out in the story that people were going to watch in the opera later. It's a scandal, but you know, it's kind of fun that they put it into this opera. Fun fact about this one is that this particular opera was the very opera that Marian Anderson performed in when she made her debut at the Metropolitan Opera House in New York City. She was the first African American to make a debut at the Metropolitan Opera House. So thanks, Verdi. We appreciate you. Fun fact about Mr. Lorenzo Da Ponte. He's important and we remember him because he was a huge contributor to making Mozart who we know and love today. So thank you, Lorenzo Da Ponte, for your contribution. But he was quite the interesting character. Raised a Jew, but his father decided he wanted to marry a Catholic woman. So Lorenzo turned into a Catholic, and then he became an ordained priest who still really loved the women and ended up being kicked out of Venice altogether together because he had a relationship with a woman and had children, even though he's an ordained priest. And so he was kicked out of Venice for 15 years. During that time, he decided to move to other places, and that's where he stumbled across Mozart, and they worked together until he ran out of money and needed to leave and ended up coming to the United States. Now, his coming to the United States was actually really impactful for the United States because he was the one to actually introduce New York City to opera. It was because of him that we got to hear Mozart's Don Giovanni for the first time, because he fully staged it for the first time ever. And he also brought Rossini to the United States because him and his niece, Giulia Da Ponte, were on a US tour, and they would sing Rossini songs, and they popularized Rossini as a result. I also love that Lorenzo Da Ponte was the first person to create the Italian Opera House. It was a theater that was specifically for opera singers and for opera. It was really amazing because it was unlike anything that had ever been created in New York City to date, and inspired the way people thought about opera houses and theater going forward. His opera house was so impactful, even though it burned down, sadly, and he did move it, but the second one also burned down. Not so great luck, poor Da Ponte. But even those two opera houses inspired the New York Academy of Music, which was the predecessor to the Metropolitan Opera House that we know today. So thank you, Lorenzo Da Ponte. Also, fun fact, he became a naturalized United States citizen, buried on 11th Street between 1st Avenue and Avenue A. But then they actually paved over that area by accident, so they were like, whoops! So they moved all of the graves from that gravesite and moved them over to Queens. So there is actually, who knows if the actual body of Lorenzo Da Ponte is even actually moved over to Calvary Cemetery in Queens, but there is a marker there at the Calvary Cemetery in Queens to show that he was maybe put here. But it might be kind of fun New York City history to walk over to 11th Street between 1st Avenue and Avenue A and give a little bit of love to Mr. Lorenzo Da Ponte, who brought opera to New York City. All right, everybody, that's my share for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you'd like to get a little bit more opera in your daily life, and tune in for my weekly videos. This is Opera Appreciation for Black folks, making opera equitable. Bye guys, see you next week. Ciao.